Welcome to Soul Rift Audio, where forgotten voices whisper through the dark. They woke before the sun, but never before the silence. They laced their corsets tighter than their emotions and wrote secrets in diaries no one was ever meant to read. These were the women history called respectable and sometimes forgot entirely. Tonight, we'll read what they couldn't say. We'll walk through the ashes of their mornings and the shadows behind their smiles, because sometimes the quietest lives leave the loudest echoes. They say the cold never truly leaves the bones, not when it's crept in through a dozen winters, each one starting the same way. With your fingers curled around the edge of a woolen blanket, not for comfort but to stop the shivers long enough to move. It was always around 4 when I woke. Not 4 in the way we think of time now. Not the gentle ring of a bedside clock or a digital screen blinking blue in the dark. No, this was 4 in the way the air itself seemed to change. A kind of stillness before the world resumed its weight. 4 was when the chill in the basement thickened, when breath turned visible, and when the silence in the scullery was so deep it almost had a sound of its own. I never needed an alarm. Habit had trained my bones better than any bell. And besides, the shame of being late, of letting Miss Henderson wake in a cold room, was a heavier burden than fatigue. So I would rise quietly so as not to wake Annie on the cot beside mine and dress in silence. My fingers clumsy with the buttons in the half-dark, the fabric stiff with the damp that never quite left our clothes. The first task was always the fires. By the time the masters stirred upstairs, they would expect the whole house to feel like a warm cradle. Never mind that the cold had clawed its way into every corner overnight. So I would carry the coal scuttle, step by step, through the still sleeping halls. My boots leaving faint echoes on the floorboards, the hem of my skirt brushing along the same lines of worn wood. And I'd kneel by each hearth, parlor, drawing room, study, and bedrooms, careful not to spill the ash, careful not to let the metal poker scrape too loud. I burned my hands more times than I can count. Coal does not care for skin, nor does it care for your gentleness or fatigue. It bites, it hisses, and yet I learned to coax it. First the paper, then the kindling, then a slow, stubborn flame. A kind of intimacy develops between you and a fire you tend each morning. It resists you at first, then softens, until finally it curls into itself and breathes like a living thing. The scent of smoke stayed with me all day. Not the pleasant sort, nothing like the hearths in novels, but the harsh, bitter tang of soot and scorched wool. My apron always bore little gray fingerprints near the pockets. Once the fires were lit, I would rush back to the scullery to prepare hot water for washing. The pipes groaned like something half asleep, and the water came slowly, steaming only if the stove had been burning since before dawn. I'd strain to carry buckets up the narrow servant stairwell, the weight tilting against my knees. My arms ached in a way that never quite went away, not even on Sundays. Breakfast followed. Not for us, of course. We ate later and little. But for them, the family upstairs, it had to be on the table by 7. Bread, lightly toasted, eggs not too runny, tea brewed for precisely 3 minutes. Mrs. Pratt, the cook, barked orders while I arranged plates, fetched napkins, and polished the silver that no one ever truly looked at but would certainly notice if dull. Every motion became muscle memory. Pour, wipe, carry, bow, and always be quiet. Be small. Once breakfast was over, the real work began. I scrubbed floors on my hands and knees, not because it was more effective, but because it was expected. The smell of carbolic soap lingered in my hair even into sleep. I dusted the corners of bookshelves that no one touched. I straightened bed skirts and folded dressing gowns and swept stairs so that not even a footprint remained. I was expected to move as though I was never there, to leave no trace. At midday, we were allowed a short meal. Bread with butter, maybe soup if Mrs. Pratt was in a generous mood. We'd sit on the wooden bench near the back stairs, shoulders hunched from habit more than cold. Some girls chatted softly, their words curling with the steam from tin mugs. Others, like me, stared at the floor, letting the moment pass without needing to fill it. By afternoon, the bell calls came. A little ring from the study meant I had to fetch a book, or perhaps move a vase slightly left. A double ring from upstairs meant I had to assist in dressing, laying out gloves and tightening corsets, and pretending not to notice bruises from whalebone stays. I was neither seen nor unseen, something in between. A pair of hands, a set of eyes that didn't meet others. Sometimes when I passed the nursery, I'd slow for a second. The sound of a child's laughter, rare, sudden, felt like a window opening in a room long sealed. The governess seldom smiled, but the children, they reminded me that not all softness had left the world, just most of it. The hardest hour, always, was twilight. It wasn't the exhaustion, though that was constant, but the strange sense of watching a world I didn't belong to. The family would gather in the drawing room. Light would soften through the lace curtains. A lamp would be lit, a piano played. Laughter floated faintly down the corridor, golden and untouchable. I would stand just beyond the doorway sometimes, not daring to step closer, my hands still warm from polishing brass or folding linens. They never saw me. Or perhaps they did, but looked past. I often wondered what it was like to sit on those velvet cushions, to drink tea poured by someone else, to end a day knowing it had been yours. By 9, we ate supper. Cold meat, more bread, a pot of weak tea. And by 10, we returned to the basement. The stairs down always felt longer at night. Our room was small and the ceiling low. We shared it, 3 of us, each with a cot and a crate for belongings. No windows, just a vent that wheezed when it rained. My feet would throb. My back, too tight to stretch properly. I would wash my hands in cold water, tie my hair with a rag, and slip under the blanket as quickly as I could manage. Sometimes in the dark, Annie would whisper about leaving, about going to America, or marrying a shopkeeper, or starting over somewhere warm. I never said much. Dreams felt like a luxury, and I had learned not to want what I could not have. But I listened, because some nights, that was enough. I never hated the house, not really. I hated the rules, the weight of things, the way your worth could vanish with a single mistake. But the house itself, it became a part of me. I knew its creaks and its corners. I knew how the light moved across its floors at different hours. I knew the scent of polish in the study and lavender in the linens. Sometimes I still dream of it. The scullery window, the ticking of the big hallway clock, the faint, smoky warmth of a freshly lit fire. And in those dreams, I am always waking, always at 4, always reaching for my apron in the dark. Because being a housemaid wasn't just a job. It was a rhythm, a ritual. It was living in the quiet spaces between other people's lives. And though no one remembers my name or the pattern on my apron or the burns on my hands, I remember. And maybe that's enough. They said I had died with him. Not in the literal sense, of course. My breath still came and went, shallow and steady. My heart still beat. But the moment they closed the lid on his coffin, they also closed the lid on me. Or so they thought. I was 37 when my husband died. Not young by society standards, but not yet old enough to fade into comfort. His death was sudden. An illness that came in the chill of early November and left me a widow before the leaves had finished falling. They called it a tragedy, a misfortune, a quiet mercy even, for he had been in pain. I remember none of those words, only the silence that followed. Because once the mourning veil fell over my face, so too did it fall over my life. There were rules, you see. A widow in respectable society was not to laugh or dance or wear anything lighter than sorrow itself. For 2 years, I was meant to disappear behind black bombazine, my body swaddled in stiff fabric that scratched at my skin and soaked up the sun before it could reach me. No music, no color, no company, save for others who spoke in hushed tones and carried their grief like a badge. They called it the noble path of mourning. But in truth, it felt like a form of erasure. And yet, I did not vanish. Not really. There was a room in the back of the house, just beyond the drawing room. It had once belonged to no one in particular, used mostly for storing linens and the odd trunk of old letters. After his passing, I claimed it. I told the servants I needed a quiet place to read scripture, to reflect. That lie, so simple and proper, gave me space. It was in that room that my real life resumed, quietly, invisibly. I began with letters. At first, the kind I was expected to write, thank you notes for condolences, polite inquiries to my late husband's colleagues. But over time, the words shifted. I wrote in journals, pages and pages of thoughts I dared not speak aloud. I wrote about rage, about how no one had asked if I was afraid or lonely or glad it was over. I wrote about the dullness of black dresses and the weight of eyes watching me even in church pews. I wrote poems, sometimes ugly, sometimes tender. I found my voice in ink, even as I kept silent in parlors. Eventually, I wrote to another widow, Margaret Finch, whose husband had died the spring before mine. We had known each other in passing, just two wives exchanging pleasantries during charity events and garden teas. But grief made our paths converge. She sent me a short note, folded in cream stationery, left anonymously with the cook. All it said was, "You're not alone. Shall we walk on Thursday?" That Thursday changed everything. We walked at the edge of Kensington Gardens, far from the main paths. Two women in black, heads bowed, voices low. But behind the veil, we smiled. We spoke of small things. How our hands had begun to feel like our own again. How the silence of widowhood was both punishment and liberation. She confessed that she had begun to read novels again, French ones. I confessed that I had sold one of his horses, not because I needed the money, but because I had always hated the way he treated it. We laughed, a sound I hadn't made in months. From then on, we met every Thursday, sometimes walking, sometimes in the back rooms of one another's houses. We brought books, newspapers, even snippets of poetry from the radicals, God forbid. And more than that, we brought our truths. I learned she had once wanted to be a painter, that she still kept her oils in the attic. I told her I had loved another man once, before my husband, and that sometimes I dreamt of him still. It was not rebellion, not really. We still dressed in mourning. We still nodded politely in public, but in private, behind drawn curtains and cold tea left forgotten, we stitched our lives back together, not as they had been, but as they could be. We were not alone. Over time, our little circle grew. There was Ellen, who had inherited her husband's business and secretly kept it running through a male cousin. Clara, who volunteered at a hospital under the name Mrs. Gray, so that no one would know she scrubbed floors beside paupers. And Lydia, the youngest of us, barely 26, who wrote articles for a radical women's paper and sent them under a pseudonym. We were widows, yes, but we were also writers, painters, thinkers, dreamers. We were women made invisible by tradition, and in that invisibility, we found room to move. It is a strange thing to find freedom in mourning, to be pitied so thoroughly that people stop watching you. No one asked where I went on Thursdays. No one questioned why I no longer hosted dinners. I had, in a way, become untouchable, respected but forgotten. And with that forgetting came breath. Do not misunderstand me. I grieved. I had loved parts of my husband, his laugh, his way of reading aloud, the way he once danced with our niece in the snow. But his love had not filled all the empty places in me. It had never asked who I was when no one watched. And I know, he never truly saw me. Most husbands didn't, but the widows did. In their presence, I became whole. We spoke not just of what we had lost, but of what we might still become. We mourned, but we also planned. We sewed ribbons into hems again, soft grays, deep violets. We let our hair down in the garden. We read by candlelight and didn't hide the tears that came when a poem struck too deep. One evening, Margaret brought a bottle of port her husband had hoarded and never let her taste. We poured it into mismatched teacups and drank slowly, the sweetness burning our tongues. To the lives we might have lived, she said. No, I replied, to the ones we still can. Time passed, as it always does. Society expected me to remarry. They assumed I would crave protection, status, a place to stand beside another man. But I never did. I wore gray instead of black, and then lavender instead of gray. I opened the windows more. I learned how to balance accounts. I kept writing. The room in the back of the house remained mine. I filled it with paper, with pressed flowers, with fragments of stories half told. Sometimes I would sit there for hours, listening to the quiet thrum of life beyond the window, thinking about how much had changed, not in the world perhaps, but in me. I do not know if the world will remember us. Most of us left little behind. No statues, no schools named in our honor. Our names faded from ledgers, from letters, from the lips of nieces and great-grandchildren. But in the quiet hours, in the rooms no one thought to enter, we had lived fully, fiercely. There is a strength in softness, in silence chosen, not imposed, in learning at last how to live not for appearances, but for truth. So when you see an old photograph, a woman in black with gloved hands and downcast eyes, do not assume you know her. She may be mourning, yes, but she may also be building something in the ashes. We were told it was an honor to be called respectable, To move through the world with eyes lowered and back straight, with lips sealed just enough to suggest humility, but not so tightly that one might seem cold or prideful. It was a fragile balance, like walking a narrow bridge in a long dress, afraid that one misstep might send everything, your name, your family's name, tumbling into shame. Respectability. It hung in the air like perfume, light, deceptive, intoxicating. And like perfume, it was always meant for others to notice, not you. From the moment I could walk without holding my mother's hand, I was taught to behave. Not just in the sense of politeness, but in a way that made my entire existence into a performance. Sit straight, speak softly, don't interrupt, cross your ankles, not your legs, laugh, but not too loudly, smile, but not too much. Be clever, but never more clever than the men in the room. It began with ribbons. Pink ones in my hair, tied so neatly it almost hurt. White ones on my Sunday gloves, untouched by dirt or rebellion. I learned quickly that the way you looked was a reflection of something deeper, or so they said. A clean frock meant a clean conscience. A tidy braid meant a tidy soul. They taught us to fold ourselves into palatable shapes, easy to swallow, impossible to forget if ruined. My mother was the keeper of those rules. She didn't smile often, but when she did, it was always in the presence of others. Her hands smelled of starch and lavender. Her voice calm but taut, like a violin string never quite tuned. She was the very image of respectability. People praised her as a woman of fine upbringing. She took pride in that title as though it were stitched into her very skin. She passed it down to me like an heirloom, but no one ever asked her if she wanted it. By 16, I understood that being respectable meant being watched. Watched when I entered a room, watched when I spoke to a gentleman, watched when I danced, only twice per evening and never too close. There was a kind of invisible ledger, a list being written in every neighbor's mind, what I wore, what I said, who I was seen with, who I wasn't. And at the bottom of that invisible page was a single question written in silence. Was she still good? It was always about goodness, though no one could agree on what that truly meant. Was it chastity, obedience, silence? There were no clear rules, only consequences. I once laughed too loudly at a supper and was told by an aunt that girls who laugh that way find themselves misunderstood. Misunderstood, of course, was a polite word for ruined, for undesirable, for lost. You did not want to be misunderstood. By 19, I had learned to disappear in plain sight. I could hold a conversation without revealing opinion. I could dress fashionably without drawing attention. I could walk beside a man and never look him in the eye. This was not cowardice, it was survival, and I was praised for it. You carry yourself like a lady, they said. Your father must be proud. And maybe he was, but I do not remember him ever saying it, only nodding, only watching, as though my entire worth existed in what I did not do. I envied the girls who didn't care, the ones who spoke with too much fire, who wore blue ribbons in their hair instead of black, the ones who flirted too boldly and danced too freely. They were talked about, of course, whispered over. But I envied their breath, their risk. I wondered if they went home and wept or laughed. I wondered if they, too, feared the weight of being seen for something other than polite. There was one girl, Lillian. She lived 2 streets over. Her father was in shipping, not quite gentry, not quite low. Lillian once read poetry aloud at a sewing circle, something French, something that made a few of the matrons shift uncomfortably. I remember how her voice curled around the syllables like silk, how her eyes did not ask for permission. A year later, she was gone. No one ever said why. There were rumors, of course, an affair, a letter, a misstep on the bridge of reputation. But I remembered her voice, not her scandal. I remembered the way she breathed when she wasn't pretending to be good. Sometimes when I was alone, I tried to breathe like her. Marriage was supposed to be the reward for all that goodness, and I was married. At 21, to a man with a good name and a house with high ceilings. He was kind in the way men were taught to be, measured, courteous, distant. He called me my dear and praised my posture. I bore him children. I kept the household running like clockwork, and I was miserable. Not because he was cruel, he wasn't, but because I was invisible even in my own skin. I had followed every rule, every thread of decorum, and all it had earned me was a life where I could not cry without apologizing, could not want without shame, could not scream without scandal. I wondered if Lillian had screamed. Sometimes I would wake in the middle of the night and sit by the window. The house would be quiet, the children asleep. I would untie my hair and let it fall past my shoulders, not because anyone could see, but because it was the only time of day I felt like I belonged to myself. Respectability, I realized, was a cage built with lace and compliments. It kept you in not by force, but by fear. Fear of being ruined, fear of being talked about, fear of becoming the woman others warned their daughters about. We wore the cage proudly and sometimes lovingly. We passed it on to our own daughters, convincing ourselves it was protection. But I wonder now, how many of us were protecting them from the world, and how many were simply too afraid to tell them the truth? That we were tired, that goodness, as it was defined, often cost us our voice, that we had dreamed of being bold once but gave it up for safety, and that respectability never truly loved us back. I am older now. My hair is silvered, my body slower. Society no longer watches me with the same scrutiny. There is a strange freedom in that, a gentleness. I sit in the garden and let my ankles show. I speak when I have something to say. I laugh without apology. But I carry her with me still, the girl who held her breath for fear of being too much. Sometimes, when I am very quiet, I write letters to her in my mind. You were never too much. You were never too loud. You were simply alive in a world that told you to shrink. I see you. I forgive you. I release you. And I hope, if anything remains of me when I am gone, that someone, somewhere, will say not that I was respectable, but that I was real. I used to believe a hairpin was just a hairpin, a simple sliver of metal, no more remarkable than a spoon or a button, something tucked into the softness of a bun meant to hold beauty in place. But I know now, beauty, when enforced, is never innocent. And the objects that shape it are rarely just objects. When I was 13, my mother sat me in front of her dressing mirror and combed my hair back tightly. She twisted it, looped it, and with one smooth motion, slid a set of hairpins in, so close to the scalp they pinched. There, she said, now you look proper. Proper. Not happy. Not free. Just proper. The pins were cold when they went in. By mid-afternoon, they'd be warm with my skin. By nightfall, they left tiny dents that throbbed when the hair came down. And still, I wore them, day after day. Not because they were useful, but because to wear your hair loose was to invite whispers, unkempt, wild, indecent. What no one said aloud was dangerous. A woman with loose hair was a woman uncontained. She might speak too freely. She might walk without reason. She might refuse to bend. And so we pinned it back. Every strand, every thought. The corset was worse. I remember the first time I wore one. Not for play, not for pretending with ribbons, but truly wore one, laced tightly, boned with whalebone, meant to train the body into something smaller. Mother stood behind me with the laces. She pulled gently at first, then firmer. My ribs resisted. My breath shortened. I gripped the bedpost. Beauty requires discipline, she murmured. I nodded, though I could not speak. The corset pressed my lungs upward, pushed my stomach inward, forced my spine into a posture that men called elegant and doctors called dangerous. I was told not to sit too long in it, but also not to remove it too often. I was warned that if I loosened it in front of the maids, they might lose respect for me. My body was no longer mine. It was a shape to be maintained, a silhouette to be admired from across a ballroom, never questioned too closely. And yet, I wore it, because to be unlaced was to be undone. It meant being read as either mad or immoral. In Victorian England, there was nothing more scandalous than a woman who breathed too deeply. We were not meant to breathe deeply, or speak too loudly, or laugh without covering our mouths. Even the clothes agreed. The layers we wore were not accidental. Camise, corset, petticoat, underskirt, overskirt, bodice, sleeves, gloves, each one a sheath, each one a silence. By the time I stepped outside, I had been wrapped 7 times over, like a secret no one wanted uncovered. I remember summer days when the heat would cling to every layer. My thighs would burn from friction, my stockings would stick. But I kept walking, smiling, because sweating was unseemly and fainting was preferable to disrobing. Once during a garden party, I nearly collapsed. The air was thick, my vision narrowed to a pinhole, and yet, when a gentleman asked if I was all right, I smiled. I smiled, because to admit discomfort was to admit weakness. And weakness, in a woman, was acceptable only when it was beautiful. We were not taught to say no, not directly, Instead, we said, perhaps, I'm not sure, let me think. We softened every refusal until it sounded like agreement. We cushioned our resistance in politeness, in deference, in ambiguity. Because to be firm was to be difficult, and difficult women were left behind. The tools of our silence were not always physical. Sometimes they were phrases, expectations, traditions dressed up as affection. Don't interrupt. Let the men talk. You'll understand when you're married. He doesn't mean to offend. It's just his way. I heard these lines so often, they became a kind of wallpaper. Present in every room, never noticed until you tried to peel them away. And so we learned. To nod instead of argue, to defer instead of decide, to compliment instead of criticize. We were fluent in the language of compromise, especially the kind that required giving up pieces of ourselves. And they called it womanly grace. I wonder now how many women broke under that grace. How many suffocated in bodices too tight, dreams too large, voices too loud for the rooms they were allowed to inhabit. I remember a friend, Eliza, who wanted to study medicine. Not nurse's training, mind you, but real medicine. Surgery, anatomy. She had read everything in her father's library by the time she was 17. They sent her away to a finishing school. When she came back, she wore the corset tighter. Her hair was pinned just so. Her eyes, once sharp, had dulled with the weight of knowing. She smiled more, but only with her mouth. She married as expected, had 2 children, and at the age of 31, she died of what the doctor called female weakness. I have always believed it was not her body that failed, but her will. It's strange, isn't it? How we buried so many women before their time and yet never questioned what had killed them. Not truly. We blamed their nerves, their hysteria, their delicate constitutions. But it wasn't delicacy that killed them. It was the performance of it. I have kept one corset, not because I wear it now, but because I refuse to forget. It hangs at the back of my wardrobe like a ghost. Sometimes I touch it. The boning still rigid, the fabric still scented faintly of rosewater and iron. I run my fingers along the laces and think about how many women stood with arms raised, waiting to be tied in. How many mothers pulled the cord and whispered, "Hold still." How many daughters obeyed. Hairpins, corsets, silence. These were not ornaments. They were instructions. They taught us to contain ourselves, to shape our bodies around men's expectations and shrink our voices until they echoed only in our own minds. But now I speak them aloud, these truths, not out of bitterness, but remembrance, not out of rebellion, but clarity. Because for too long, we were made to believe that elegance and obedience were the same, that silence was safety, that to be good was to be quiet, and to be quiet was to be loved. I know now, love does not require silence. It does not demand a smaller waist or pinned hair or lips that never say no. I leave my hair loose some mornings. I let it fall across my back like a promise kept. I wear linen dresses that breathe. I speak when I feel moved. I laugh with my whole body. And I remember Eliza. I remember my mother. I remember the little girl I once was, standing stiff in a corset that wasn't yet hers. To her I say, you were never too much. You were never meant to be folded into silence. You were meant to sing, and now you may. They never meant for us to read their words. These were not pages written for publication or stories meant to be told at family gatherings. These were secrets, tucked beneath floorboards, sewn into hems, hidden behind loose bricks in the attic. Ink-stained breathings of girls who had no other place to speak. But now, over a century later, the paper still whispers. The handwriting is small, cautious, sometimes slanted, as though the words themselves were afraid. Other times hurried, angry, spilling over the edge of the page like water breaking through a dam. And always, always written in private. When the door was locked, when the candles burned low, when no one was listening, except the paper. One diary was found behind a crumbling fireplace in Norfolk. It belonged to a girl named Eleanor, aged 16. Her entries begin like many others, weather reports, garden walks, sewing lessons. But then by the 5th page, something shifts. Her words grow sharper. She writes of a girl named Agnes. Agnes held my hand too long today. She said my name softly as though tasting it. When she left, I sat very still and did not breathe. It felt like I was full of stars. Eleanor never uses the word love. She didn't have the language, but it's there. In the pauses, the tremble of her sentences. She writes about Agnes's laughter, the way her sleeves brushed against her own, the ache that came when they said goodbye. In one entry she writes, "I think if I told anyone, they would burn me like a letter never meant to be opened." She never did tell. Her diary ends abruptly. A final entry. "Father says I am to marry a Mr. Hill. I do not know him, but he will know nothing of Agnes. After that, nothing more." Another diary, worn leather barely held together by twine, was found in an attic chest in Manchester. It belonged to a girl named Mary Ann. She was 15 when she began writing. Her words are clenched tight like fists. "Mother hit me with the belt again. I did not cry until she left. I think I am bad. I must be, for she says it so often." Her entries are short, brutally short, as if too much ink might be dangerous. But she records every injury, every slap, every insult. "She poured ink on my dress today, said I was wicked for dreaming of books. Father watched, he did nothing." And then, scattered between the pain, come glimpses of light. A kind teacher. A kindred cat that visits her window. The thrill of touching a novel not approved by the vicar. I read one line 3 times. A woman crossed a field alone, just walked, just because. I nearly cried at the thought. Mary Ann stopped writing after her 17th birthday. Her final line is a question. Will I ever be allowed to belong to myself? There were so many like them. Girls who grew up in households that praised obedience but ignored bruises. Who were told to be grateful for silence. Who wrote because no one ever asked them how they felt. One diary, small and covered in pressed flowers, was hidden beneath the floorboards of a girls' boarding school in Brighton. The owner never signed her name, but she was a dreamer. Her pages overflow with sketches, pressed petals, and long looping thoughts. I want to go to India, or perhaps France, or perhaps nowhere at all, just somewhere that isn't here. She writes about feeling too large for the life she's been given. Not in body, but in spirit. They tell me I must marry, and I will, but not before I write everything down, so that one day, someone will know I was more than a dress and a smile. I was fire under lace. Fire under lace. I read that line again and again, because that's what so many of them were. Fires, carefully contained, trained to flicker just bright enough to light a drawing room, but never enough to burn. Some wrote about dreams, becoming artists, scientists, explorers, things that were not for girls. One even tried to document the insects in her garden in scientific terms. She gave them Latin names. She wrote about their wings, their patterns. She wanted to publish it. Her father burned the pages when he found them. She started again, in secret, on scraps of paper, stored in a wooden box behind the laundry room. Those scraps were found 50 years later, eaten through by time, but still legible, still defiant. There is something unspeakably brave about writing when you are not allowed to exist fully, about claiming space on a page when you are denied it everywhere else. For these girls, the diary was not just a record. It was resistance, a place where they could scream without sound, where they could be ugly, angry, passionate, ambitious, without fear of correction. Some diaries had poems tucked in the margins. Love poems, yes, but also poems of rage, of longing, of boredom so sharp it made the bones ache. I want to know what it feels like to run without permission. I hate the way they talk to me, as if I am made of glass. I want to be stone. I want to be sea. Today I thought about drowning, not because I want to die, but because it would be a moment that belonged to me. These weren't mad girls. They weren't dangerous. They were simply alive in a time that told them not to be. The saddest entries are the ones where they try to convince themselves that it's not so bad, that things will improve, that they're just being childish. Perhaps mother is right. Perhaps I do ask too many questions. I must learn to be content. That is what good girls do. And then a week later, I cannot bear the silence anymore. It sits in my throat like stones. We often romanticize the past, the dresses, the dances, the candlelight, but inside those dresses were ribs pressed too tight. Inside those ballrooms were girls who danced because they had no other way to scream. Their diaries tell the truth, and that truth is not tidy. It's messy, complicated, full of contradictions. They loved and hated, they dreamed and despaired, they obeyed and secretly rebelled. They were real, and now they speak to us across time, through their ink, through their trembling hands, through the lines they wrote when no one was watching. Please remember me, not as they saw me, but as I really was. I do. We do. We read their words now, not to invade their privacy, but to give them something they were never allowed in life: witness. These diaries, hidden for so long, now lie open. They teach us that the truth finds a way, that the quietest voices, given time, can echo the loudest, and that a girl with a pen, locked in her room, was never powerless. She was simply waiting for us to listen. They folded their pain into silence and pressed their dreams between pages no one ever turned. But maybe, by listening tonight, we've unfolded just a corner of who they were. Not just housemaids or widows or proper ladies in corsets, but girls who dared to think. Women who longed to be free. They never meant for us to read these words. But maybe, just maybe, that's why we must. You were never alone in your silence, and neither were they. Good night, and may their stories stay with you just a little longer than you expected.